I want to go back a little bit too, just to make sure everybody understands. And you have a really heavy S&D role, and then you wanted to move into the director of aviation role, which is awesome. And we don't see a lot of that. We see very few schedulers and dispatchers move into that role. Not that they're not capable, but I'd like to kind of work on that conversation. Not only did you become capable of doing that, you are now in a role where you're helping consult other companies about looking maybe outside the box. So I kind of want to talk about what does that look like from maybe a consultant's role, or perhaps the director of aviation when they're hiring for the new director, and what could we as schedulers and dispatchers do to put our best foot forward? How do we get hired? How do we get noticed?
Yeah, so you've hit on a sensitive subject in the sense that this is extremely frustrating for me in the role that I now have as a consultant, to see how unbalanced the equation is.
Hello and welcome to the Business Aviation Collective podcast. We're sponsored by LD Aviation. I'm Lindsay Dyer, your host, and today we get a chance to talk to Andy Mawdsley. Andy is the director with Van Allen currently, and has a lot of experience in scheduling dispatching role, which is really unique in the consultant role, I think. And he also has a master's degree in marriage and family therapy, and we're going to hear a little bit later on how that helps him out in aviation. Welcome, Andy.
Thanks, Lindsay. Good to see you again. Can't remember when last we saw each other, but certainly it's always good to reconnect.
Yeah, likewise. I think that might have been in at base, maybe in October, Orlando, maybe. Anyway, but yeah, it's been a while. So excellent. Thanks again for your time. And I'm really excited to talk to you because you did not start out in aviation. Like I mentioned in the intro, your education comes in family therapy and counseling. So can you tell us, how did you get from that type of education? Like, how did you get into aviation?
Yeah, certainly non-traditional when you look at the resume. And to be honest, when you say that, it's causing me to think, hey, what do I have on my profile that I should probably look at and see if that should still be on there? I've done a few things over the course of my career since graduating, thinking that when I went to school, I got my master's, I did go on after that and get a PhD and also in marriage and family therapy, thinking or having the objective at the time of wanting to be a professor. That was the objective. I'm going to go teach at a college. Mm-hmm. But in terms of timing, which is true of most industries, I think certainly in aviation, timing plays a big factor. It just was not, those opportunities were not that available.
Okay.
And so I'm trying to remember what the decisive thing was that was a little bit of a detour. And so just as sort of the quick version of it, in the time between graduating college with the PhD, because I went straight from the master's and the PhD. After that, and to the time I became a dispatcher, I have done, well, most of what I did, to be honest, was actually in ministry. So I used the counseling degree in a church context and did a variety of roles where I ended up moving in order to get into a different role. So I started out as a youth pastor, then a family minister, which is when I lived in California, by the way.
That's right. Southern California? No, you said Central.
Yeah.
That's right. Central California.
And then pulpit minister in Tupelo, Mississippi. So I get to see the birthplace of Elvis.
Big difference between California and Mississippi, I'm sure.
A big difference. Yeah. We took a detour really from that point based on personal things in our life. And so one of the things that have always allowed us to be able to move is my wife is a corporate flight attendant. When we first got married, she was an airline flight attendant for Northwest, since Northwest got acquired by Delta. When 9/11 happened, she was medium seniority at Northwest. After 9/11, she ended up back on the reserve after being at the airline for almost a decade, I think. So she was on reserve and watching the numbers just creep closer and closer to hers. And so she made a decision to take her career into her own hands, branched out and got into private aviation, which resulted in us making a move. But until then, we were always able to move with my job. This was the first time where we ended up moving for her job, which was up to the Midwest in Michigan, where she got hired as a cabin attendant for Pentastar Aviation.
Sure. Okay.
We were barely there for a month, and she comes home and says, "Hey, I just found out they're looking for a flight follower, and all you need is a commercial pilot's license," which I had. So I applied and got on with Pentastar as a flight follower, working the weekend midnight shifts. I would work 6 to 6, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Okay. I'd spend Monday getting back on a daytime schedule.
Okay.
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and part of Friday, I would flight instruct at a little local flight school on the field.
You had your commercial license, so you liked flying. I mean, you had been pursuing flying in general over throughout your career. Okay, cool.
Yep. So I don't know where it came from. I think there's a little bit of a genetic component in there, if it's possible. But I discovered at some point along the way that my grandfather had been a pilot. He never did fly in the war, but he received his training in South Africa.
Oh, wow.
Which is where I grew up, which is where my mom was born, and I grew up in South Africa. And so making that connection about flying was really interesting to me when I got into it, because I wasn't exactly sure what it was about that had stoked my interest, because my parents were not aviators, although my dad did work for, I think at the time it was called Rhodesian Airlines. It's been a long time ago, as a sheet metal fabricator.
Okay.
But I had done the private pilot. And then when I was in between jobs at some point after college and all of those kinds of things, I had an opportunity to just go and stash myself away in Oklahoma at a flight school, came out with the CFI and II with probably a total of just over 200 hours on my belt, thinking I was going to fly, but the same thing happened where I couldn't find a flight instructing gig. And so ultimately, when I got that job flight following at Pentastar, it gave me the freedom on my days off, because I was only working the 312s. I was able to flight instruct on my day off. Again, still thinking that I would end up in the cockpit, but my time at Pentastar in the 5 years I was there afforded me an opportunity to move into a crew scheduler role. There were two of us doing just that role full time for, I don't remember, I think we had total crew was over 50, given the number of aircraft that we managed. And so between scheduling school, passports, visas, all of those kinds of things, it took two of us to manage that workload.
Yep.
So I did the flight following. They did send me to school where I got my dispatch license, and the crew scheduling for a couple of years. And then an opportunity came in to step into the OCC supervisor role, which I did. So again, a pretty large detour from what I thought I was going to do in terms of degree. But in terms of the skill set that you develop in doing counseling, working with people, usually people that are having a rough time, they generally don't come to you when things are going well. So there's oftentimes a lot of tension. I have found, certainly in this role that I'm currently in, that every time we go to do, say, a performance review at a department that's saying, hey, we need some help here, we're struggling with some things, or we just want you to look at us and tell us how we're doing. When they found out that I have this academic background, they were like, well, that's us. You know, we're like one big dysfunctional family, and we need some help. And the reality is that there's an element of that. Some of these people spend more time together at work than they do with their own families. Yeah. So there is an element of thinking about how people relate and interact with one another that has been extremely helpful to me in my current role.
Yeah, it's super great correlation. So you were at Pentastar, you moved up kind of through the ranks, and then you moved on to a Part 91.
I moved to California. So during the time I was at Pentastar, we took on a helicopter program, a survival flight program, right? The HEMS operator, which was new territory for us to get into the rotor-wing piece. But the chief pilot of that operation had accepted a position on the West Coast, and he kept calling me sort of every few weeks when he was out there saying, hey, there's a role for you here. It's not open, but it's going to come open. And sure enough, after a little bit over a year of him being there, he reached out and said, hey, I'm looking for a supervisor of our operations control center. It's a different operation because all we have is helicopters, and the work is incredibly unique. If you've ever seen what utility companies do with helicopters and the things that they can do with helicopters, it is amazing. And so I jumped at the opportunity to learn something new. And I think that has been a marker for me in terms of my career progression that has always been a rewarding element. Every time I have said yes to something new and different, it has only benefited me in the long run.
Good point. I mean, I think I could agree with you as well. Every project or opportunity that has been offered, I usually say yes, and it's been great. So that's a good suggestion, I think, for any of our listeners as well. Say yes to those projects. Yep. Sorry, I got you off track there. Okay.
I even had just a quick side note on this one. When I was working for that same utility on the West Coast, I had a completely non-aviation related opportunity presented to me. They were very intentional, and I applaud them for this. And I think more organizations could do a better job along these lines. But they recognized that they had a lot of people stepping into new roles of leadership. That people were getting promoted to a supervisor or a manager or some role of responsibility, whether it was an individual contributor role or whether they were over teams.
Okay.
And so they required anybody new to role to go into a year-long leadership training program. And they would do some psychometrics through it. They only met 9 times over the course of that year, but that was just to manage people's schedules effectively. And as part of that, they would visit different sectors of the organizations so that you would get exposure to the steam generation side, the distribution side, aviation. We would host those groups through aviation, right? Because it gave them exposure to something 80% of the company didn't even know we had an aviation department, right? And so it was great exposure because we were hitting all the leaders, the fresh leaders that were coming through. But they were very intentional about that kind of exposure, a lot of mentoring, and mentoring was a required component. You had to identify someone that you wanted to work with. I connected with an individual at the time who was the VP of distribution, who I continue to remain in touch with long after I left that organization. Just a fantastic individual. But I think because of that exposure that we had an encounter, that utility supports all of the power supply, including water, which is unusual for them. They typically are just electric. But on the island of Catalina, they provide everything, the full scope from water to gas and electric.
Neat.
They had a drought that was so severe that it was intruding into the existing wells on the island. So they needed to get fresh water transported to the island for these camps that were on the island as well as for residents. But our focus was primarily these Boy Scout camps and folks that were coming in by the hundreds, right, to a certain part of the island that most people don't get exposed to. So I raised my hand for that. My director said, "Is this something you're interested in?" It's a project manager role to sort of find a way to get these people water. And so I raised my hand for that. And I was commuting back and forth to the island of Catalina, staying on the island sometimes for a week at a time, finding problem solving, building relationships with the residents, and finding ways to get them fresh drinking water. What an amazing opportunity that I was so fortunate to have. And the friendships I've generated out of that, again, continue. I still get texts, around special occasions. They're like, "Hey, how you doing? Remember this?" Those kinds of things. But that's completely off base. And I share it only to say sometimes you think about, well, I don't want to leave aviation because this is where my heart is.
Yep.
Well, I wasn't leaving. It was a temporary assignment. It was about a year long, but it was an amazing opportunity to develop myself in ways that I wouldn't otherwise have done if I had said no.
Yeah. So there's another suggestion. Go ahead and say yes to some of those non-aviation jobs. I know I've done some non-aviation, gone out. Then I realized what I liked about aviation and came back to it.
Right.
But yeah, great. That's awesome. Catalina Island. I've driven by, seen it out there, but I've never been.
It's worth a visit. Some breathtaking scenery.
I bet. Oh, very cool. So then where did you head over to? You went from Southern California to the opposite side?
I did. So Teterboro was the destination work-wise. I actually lived in Pennsylvania. I just could not see myself living in New Jersey or being able to afford living in New Jersey. Let's face it.
My goodness, you've had some really big, I want to say, temperature, culture jumps across the U.S.
Yeah, California, that was a shock. California to the Northeast was definitely a shock to the system, for sure. One of the individuals, when I was the supervisor in the utility on the West Coast, my dispatcher had quit for an opportunity with Dassault Falcon Jet for a new program that they were starting that continues today called the AOG Response Coordinator, or the ARC. I stayed in touch with him and thought, that's something I think I want to try. I want to get back into the fixed wing environment, and working for an OEM seemed like a good idea. And he had nothing but good to say about it. Now, he lived in their satellite location in Boise, which he really thrived in that location, and it wasn't too much of a change from California as far as the scenery. But I ended up taking the role in Teterboro. And again, a great learning experience because the structure was sitting in a command center with 6 individuals that are directly across from one another with a big dashboard with AOG events, tracking, and weather, and things of that nature.
And for maybe those listeners that don't know what an AOG response, it's probably pretty explanatory in the name, but you would send an airplane with a part to an aircraft that was not able to take off or move because they're missing the part, right? And you would send maintenance techs along with.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. So the structure provided 3 options, at least the way that Dassault operates their program. Some operators, OEMs, use their demo aircraft, for example. Mm-hmm. Dassault elected to purchase 2 Falcons, one in Europe, in Paris, and one in Teterboro in terms of its base location, and then put them on a 135 certificate so that they were not demo aircraft. They specifically were clean, definitely operated under Part 135. And so the options became, if someone called in with AOG, depending on the severity of the AOG, is do they just need a part? We can ship them the part, and we would arrange that shipping. Depending on how urgently they needed it or where it was, we would send the aircraft with the part. Typically, if we were doing that, it was also because they needed option 2, which was an AOG response team. So a maintenance team that could resolve the AOG for them, particularly if there was a sense that it could be resolved in quick fashion and there was a level of urgency, right? So those were those 2 options. And the third was, hey, it might be a chance that either the part doesn't fix it or the team can't fix it in time, or we can't even get either the part to you in time. We will send the aircraft and it will do the trip on your behalf instead of the original aircraft, right? So they had the 3 options as a resolution to the AOG. So certainly a unique model.
Yep.
With in terms of the role, the one departure, you definitely need the logistics mindset, which is what a dispatcher scheduler is there for, right? Is thinking about solutions to challenges.
Yep.
It's coming up with answers to what look like impossible scenarios, and good dispatchers and schedulers figure those things out. They have this logistics problem-solving mindset. The one downside is for them, that's all you had, right? So we never had a happy customer. So whenever you answer the phone, you knew that the person on the other end of the phone more than likely was going to be pretty upset and not their best self. And so it requires a level of diplomacy, a level of customer service and ability to talk them off the ledge, so to speak, and provide them with solutions that will make their day a little bit better than it was before they called you.
Which is where your role and your education, I'm sure, came in very handy.
Right.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
Very cool. All right. So you went California, Teterboro. Where was your next?
Next was, I had an opportunity through a connection I made by working for Dassault with an operator in Northwest Arkansas, which, disclaimer, I will say of all the places I've had the good fortune to live in, we've been blessed certainly to have good opportunities. Northwest Arkansas is one of my favorites, and I consider it a hidden secret that most people don't know about. They just have a mindset of what Arkansas is, that maybe it's a little bit backwards or slower than the rest of the country. Northwest Arkansas has 3 Fortune 500 companies in that one small community in terms of headquarters. Walmart being obviously the biggest, Tyson Foods, and then JB Hunt Trucking. So I had the good fortune to work as a dispatcher for one of those organizations that had satellite locations at the time where we ran shuttle operations. And so that was my, again, exposure to something new, working with shuttle operations and then dispatching these aircraft both domestically and internationally. And for them at the time, I think there was a value add in terms of the background that I brought to the table for them, where we were able to structure something akin to a release. We didn't, formally, like most departments, they were self-dispatching. But we wanted more structure behind it, where there was a very intentional conversation between the flight crew and the scheduler dispatcher about what was about to happen. And trust me, on board member movement days, we had 7 aircraft up in the sky at one point, crisscrossing the whole country.
Wow.
You have to have a good sense of everybody being on the same page, especially when something goes wrong, when an aircraft goes AOG or they're about to go AOG as soon as they land, right? There's a lot of coordination that needs to happen. And so
sure is.
That was a good experience. I would go back to Northwest Arkansas in a heartbeat in terms of a place to live as far as a community. Just a fantastic environment.
All right. Well, now I want to go visit because I think I have one friend who gets teased all the time about where he's from, Arkansas. And I just really never thought about it, but that sounds great. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful spot. All right. Good to know. And so I'm kind of curious, in that flight department, you said you had 7 aircraft. How many dispatchers or how many schedulers did you have at a time?
So there were essentially 2 of us that were dispatchers. One was the scheduling manager, let's call her that.
Okay.
Myself as a lead dispatcher. And then we had a third who was more in the traditional scheduler role, did not have the license.
Okay.
And focused predominantly on some of the administrative post-flight logbook reconciliation, expenses, those kinds of things, but also heavily focused on the shuttle operations because we ran shuttles on a schedule. They weren't just ad hoc shuttles. And then the 3 of us, certainly all hands on deck when it came time to board movements and things of that nature. So, and all of us were co-located. So I think they probably could have used the benefit of one being at one of the other locations, but it never was an issue that caused a problem. Just meant you had crews that were not co-located with you.
Okay. Sure.
But in terms of being able to manage the fleet of 7, trying to think, 3 were at headquarters, the rest on 2 different satellite locations.
Okay. All right. Oh, a lot to manage. That sounds like fun, though.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So now you kind of got back down a little bit into the southern. You headed after that, you went further south.
Yeah. So I ended up where I am now, which is New Orleans, incredibly hot, as you and I were talking about earlier. Yes. Sometimes I regret the decision, but I would rather be hot than be back in Michigan shoveling snow. I made a promise to myself never to have to own a snow shovel or a snow blower again. So
I feel you. Yep.
We're at least doing good on that end, but we have hurricanes and other threats here to worry about. So,
but pretty good food down there, though.
Absolutely. You're going to put on some weight when you come to New Orleans.
I bet.
I can't remember the last time we had S&D here, but a lot of people come because of the reputation of New Orleans. Let's put it that way.
Boy, well, we should talk to that board, the committee, and ask them if we can't head that way again soon.
The one thing I will say about my move back here that is worth sharing, I think, with the group that might be listening is this was an opportunity to work for the same individual that had hired me and stole me from Pentastar on the West Coast. He ended up at this utility. Again, I was back in the utility company, this time with a blend of corporate aircraft and all the other work being heavily contracted. And I took a new role. So the role here was no longer scheduling dispatching. This role was safety and governance.
Okay.
As a utility that had a couple of contractor fatalities, and if you again saw the work that these power line companies do with helicopters, you'd understand how those probably happen with some frequency. In fact,
if anybody's listening, you should Google up those pictures of that. It's pretty awesome.
Just Google aerial saw, and you will see the work method with the helicopter that you would not otherwise believe. And human external cargo, that's the other one, because that's an individual hanging from a 50-foot or 100-foot long line beneath the helicopter, getting ready to do some power line work. It's pretty wild.
Oh, I haven't seen that one. I'm going to Google that one up.
Just this week, I sent an email out to a bunch of our utility customers that we partner with in my current role, highlighting that we're seeing a very alarming trend in the utility space where there's been 4 accidents in the last 6 weeks of helicopters performing power line patrol. That's not even doing construction work. That's just patrol.
Uh-huh.
Four accidents in the last 5 weeks that we know of. In fact, I know of one in addition to that was deemed not reportable. They called the FSDO and the FSDO said,
okay.
In my mind, it probably is reportable. Mm-hmm. But there's that gray area when you look at NTSB 830, does it reach the threshold,
right,
or damages and so on and so forth. So that aside, that's an alarming statistic. Again, we're a large territory, but it's one that causes concern. That said, that was my role. Because of the fatalities we had, they stood up this new operation that was intended to have more intentional oversight of vendors. Until then, it was sort of anybody in the organization that had a need for a helicopter would just, call Bob's Flying Service or someone that they knew, right? There was no intentionality about what's the level of training that these pilots have? How are the aircraft maintained, right? There was no auditing. There was none of that. So that was my role, providing on the corporate side, the SMS oversight, but on the vendor management, which is the biggest piece, the sort of the governance and the oversight of not just helicopters, but any contracted aerial service, which became big for us in the UAS space.
I bet.
Which I am almost certain, I don't know the volume or the diversity of your audience, but I can almost guarantee that a bunch of them, as an aviation department, have inherited aviation, have inherited UAS operations as part of what they do, because people just see aviation and say, here, it's yours, provide some oversight of this, which I think on the one hand can be a little alarming when it's just shoved in your lap, but on the other hand falls into that bucket we've already talked about, that is opportunity.
Yep.
This is your opportunity.
That's cool. So you've got fixed wing, you've got helicopters, you've got drones, you have all sorts of experience, and you're back down in the South now. And it's kind of cool that you followed a leader. So obviously that leader that you went to work for the second time was worthy of that. I think that's really kind of cool, because he obviously was good at leading in general, because he was hired onto another company in what sounds to be maybe a larger role. And you guys kept that connection, that kept that network up and kept in touch.
This is maybe a unique component to that, but it's a way that that relationship came full circle. In my current role, I ended up my current role with Van Allen because I believed sufficiently in myself and my experience to say, I'm going to apply for a director of aviation role.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that process, the search was being run by Van Allen.
Okay. Yeah.
And through the process of me applying for a different company organization, Don, who you had on this podcast not too long ago, saw enough in me where he said, I think we can use that skill set to build up our utility side of aviation and support what we do as an organization in the consulting space. And so I ended up inadvertently with that. But one of the things we do is executive leader searches. I told you earlier, we generally don't do sort of regular staff level roles. Mm-hmm. We don't generally hire dispatchers or maintenance or even chief pilots.
Yep.
On exception, we do, but typically we focus on the director of aviation or director of maintenance or higher.
Sure.
One of the searches, when I came on board, we had 5 of those going on at one time. And we ended up with a search where the person that came to mind for me as the best fit for this organization was the leader that had hired me at those 2 previous organizations. And today, he now sits as a VP of operations for the organization that was conducting the search. So full circle in terms of our level of engagement.
Oh my gosh. And such another really good reminder to everybody who's listening that networking is so important. The relationships that you make in this industry over the years, very important. two things. One, don't burn bridges and every relationship, even if you have some struggles with it, most likely you're going to see that person later on down in your career or in,
Right.
in your workings. And two, those relationships that are awesome you can use to leverage them, or they can leverage your knowledge. Yeah. That networking is just
Exactly. Which,
so important.
when I look back on my career, the things that I consider, where did I make a good decision or a good choice about my career? Well, one, I already told you, was say yes to the opportunities.
Yep.
Two, as you said, is maintain those good relationships. So when you find good leaders, attach yourself at the hip to those people.
Mm-hmm.
And the third is one of the most influential things I ended up doing in my career was choosing to be a part of NBAA Schedulers and Dispatchers Committee.
Yeah.
Because of my moves, I ended up not being able to complete when I joined, it was a 7-year term.
Okay.
I ended up not being able to complete my 7th year, but that's how long I was on that committee. And through that engagement, the amount of connections and relationships that I've been able to forge have been an absolute blessing and godsend to me in terms of helping me be successful in what I do, right? Some of those are vendors, some of those are peer schedulers and dispatchers. That whole mix is just an opportunity to grow yourself professionally and to meet the right kinds of people that you need to meet in order to be successful in this. Because it is small, right? Everybody knows.
It is. It is. It's very small. Hands down, great suggestion. If you're just getting into the industry, there's a way to just be a member of the NBAA, which would give you access to the S&D committee and what they're doing. If you're part of a flight department, you can join that way.
Right.
For those who maybe don't know what it is, I will put it down I'll link it at the bottom in the notes section in case anybody wants to grab it.
Sure. And the other is obviously your regional, right?
Yes.
Some of the regionals tend to have a little bit more success than others, but they are a great way to get involved, and certainly to network with your folks that you need. I've seen things as bizarre as, because someone made that kind of connection by being on a committee and volunteering their time, that there came a time down the road where they were AOG somewhere and wanted to park their aircraft in a hangar. One of their committee members has a hangar on that field, and they've arranged, they've worked out insurance and other kinds of things and parked their aircraft in the hangar to have it taken care of, which never would have happened otherwise.
Sure. That's awesome. Good example. I want to go back a little bit too, just to make sure everybody understands and sees you have a really heavy S&D role. And then you wanted to move into the director of aviation role, which is awesome. And we don't see a lot of that. We see very few schedulers and dispatchers move into that role. Not that they're not capable, but I'd like to kind of work on that conversation. Not only did you become capable of doing that, you are now in a role where you're helping consult other companies about looking maybe outside the box. So I kind of want to talk about, what does that look like from maybe a consultant's role, or perhaps the director of aviation when they're hiring for the new director? And what could we as schedulers and dispatchers do to put our best foot forward? How do we get hired? How do we get noticed?
Yeah. So you've hit on a sensitive subject in the sense that this is extremely frustrating for me in the role that I now have as a consultant, to see how unbalanced the equation is. And I think Don probably touched on this when you had the conversation with him.
Yeah.
But one of the things we really try to work on, certainly an area that we see as lacking, is in two aspects. One is, when you talk about thinking outside of the box, is trying to convince these executives, the hiring executives, to avoid the temptation to go with the default. And the default historically has been, hey, you're a tenured pilot, and based on tenure alone, you deserve to have this leadership role. When you think about the daily roles and responsibilities, the tenured pilot goes to prepares to go to an aircraft, does all the pre-flight planning, all those things that are incredibly complex. But the same skill set that a dispatcher has, right? In terms of that level of preparation.
Sure, right.
That individual climbs up the steps of the airplane and turns left. And that's it, pretty much. especially if they have a cabin attendant on board to do a lot of the other activities.
Sure.
Now, there's some other things that they have to do. Don't get me wrong. And certainly they're part of the troubleshooting and the problem solving when things go awry. But your dispatcher and scheduler is touching every aspect. They're touching the client. They're touching the third-party vendors, the fuel vendor, the caterer, right? They're touching all of these different services and really have much more of a big picture perspective of the operation than this narrow mindset of someone that has spent years at the controls of an aircraft. Not to say that they can have developed some skills by taking on other projects, and we do see that. There are some really sound leaders that came through the pilot ranks, but tenure alone does not endow you with some innate ability to lead a team, a diverse team of schedulers, maintenance personnel, and other pilots.
Yeah.
Whereas we see dispatchers have a lot more exposure to all of those people, work with them on a daily basis, and probably have a means of a very solid perspective, I would say, of knowing that I need to treat pilot A differently than pilot B because they respond differently, right? And they have a sense, which is really in the emotional quotient bucket, that they have an understanding of how to work with people and how to solve problems. And they make good candidates. I shared with you before we started today that I've made a list earlier thinking of all the strong female leaders that I saw. Mm-hmm. When you look at our industry, if you go to Schedulers and Dispatchers Committee or to the convention, for example, you will see it pretty heavily female dominated in terms of this role. And they've had to, in many cases, fight to get there through a former admin role, scheduler, now maybe some more professional recognition. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, there's a ceiling there where as you step beyond that and go back to the departments and look who's in the leadership role, there's not a lot of women out there.
Right.
And that is the frustrating piece for us. And again, when I look at that list, I'm like, I think of a Lindsay, yourself, and the success you've had, right? You've had to take a lot of risk to get where you are. Mm-hmm. And the amount of years it's taken you to be able to get to where you are, right? A lot of blood, sweat, and tears. I think of Lisa Swartzwelder, who is in a solid leadership role with Limited. I think of Kelly Rittenhouse. I think of Kelly at a point in my career where we worked together at Pentastar as a mentor for me, as someone who steered me toward CAM. She was one of the first folks to get their CAM and has really pushed down every barrier to become successful in what she does. Leanne Beckett at XCOL, what great success story she is. But out of a list of about 20, I can only list 4 or so of them that fall into that category. When I look at the rest, I see at least 50% where I think, wow, they are incredibly gifted at what they do. Mm-hmm. I think you and I were talking earlier about Amber Fincham at State Farm. How talented is she? How good is she? Those that went to S&D when she was the chairperson. Yeah. What an amazing job that she did. She's on her city council in her little community, right? She is a leader. And yet the organization, I don't know, recognizes that maybe she would be a viable candidate to step into the director of aviation role where she is. And I hear that so much when we go around. And so at least for Don and I, when we have this great fortune of being involved in a leadership discussion, mm-hmm. we will ask the hiring executive, hey, can we think about this a little bit differently and think not just about women leaders, but about scheduler dispatchers being viable candidates, and also in some cases directors of maintenance who bring great skill sets with them, but experience some of the same ceiling mindset that says, hey, you're a director and that's it. Don't expect to be the leader of the whole aviation department. We had recent success placing an individual in that capacity. Now, it took some iterations to get there as we presented candidates, but we had success in convincing them to do both. Meaning, let's present to you a female candidate, a strong female candidate, scheduler, dispatcher background, mm-hmm. and let's present to you a director of maintenance candidate. And the director of maintenance individual ended up filling that role. So we count that as a win for us, but it's one. It's the pebble in the pond, right? We need more of those for the circles to grow and more people to have those kinds of opportunities.
Do you think a certain amount of it also might be on the scheduler dispatcher side in terms of, and I may ruffle some feathers this way, but I'm thinking perhaps some of us are not saying that we want to be in that role or even thinking that's a possibility because we haven't seen it, right? So maybe our leadership doesn't even know we would like that position, or maybe we're not making strides towards adding to our experiences or education level so that we could be on par with somebody else who's applying for that. I feel like not only does leadership need to hopefully think outside the box and look at some of these candidates, but us as schedulers and dispatchers, we need to go out there and say, I do want that and I can do it. And I think I would like to see more of that.
100%. There is absolutely a component of folks that, for a variety of reasons, one, which you and I had talked about earlier, with this imposter syndrome and self-doubt that says, I just don't think I can.
Right.
But having sort of the strength to, again, it goes back to what are those things that you're choosing to do in your career that are going to help you be successful and get to that goal, and of saying yes to opportunities, whether they look like the right opportunity or not, is finding a way to make the most of those opportunities, networking with the right people. And certainly your leader needs to understand that you have that ambition and that goal. Mm-hmm. And, I think of Tracy for you, right, who recently became a part of your team. Tracy and I had the great fortune to work together. Tracy took things into her own hands, right? She said, in order for me to think that I'm going to be successful as a leader, I'm going to need at least some academic bolstering to my resume. And so while she was working as a dispatching supervisor, managing a full workload, she went and said, I'm going to do my MBA on the side.
Right.
Which is not easy to do. Anyone that has worked a full-time job, I've done a lot of school and I would never have wanted to work at the same time as doing everything that I did. And that's a master's level program, which is no small task. But she recognized a couple of things. One, I need that education to make me better, give me additional skill set. And two, she hitched herself to a couple of mentors. She found a strong female mentor in the organization, someone that she could bounce things off of. And she had a director, fortunately, at the time that believed in her and gave her some opportunities to develop. So those are things that I think, yes, you have to start with expressing the desire and set that as a goal. I have ambition to be a leader, whether it is the leader of this department or not, who knows, but that is a desire I have. Will you help me get there? And then it's the things like setting yourself up for, I think Don covered a lot of these, and so I won't hash them over too much, but the GSU classes, Darden University, the leadership development, he placed a heavy emphasis on an executive MBA. You may not have access to that in your role, right? If your organization, which most do today, I think, provide the tuition reimbursement.
Yes.
Take advantage of that. And then secondly, if they provide internal leadership training along the lines that I had shared, I had a great opportunity at the utility company on the West Coast where they developed leaders. If you're new to role, every leader had to go through a year-long program that included being assigned a mentor. You got to pick. And that mentorship thing, I think, is critical. NBAA has really tried to push this over the last couple of years, and I can't say enough about find yourself a good mentor. Don is heavy on that component. He gives a lot of his time to doing that. Certainly, I'm willing to participate in that way for people that have the desire. I know Tracy would.
Yeah.
All of these names we've already mentioned, I can't imagine a single one of them saying no to someone saying, will you help me in my career?
I agree.
And steer me in those decisions. So pitch yourself to somebody that you see as successful, right? If you don't know Leanne, if you don't know Kelly Rittenhouse, if you don't know Joe D'Amato, if you don't know Jenny Showalter, then meet those people or ask someone to introduce you and make a connection and say, I want to be mentored. I want you to help me grow into this role, and set the mindset of you deserve to be a leader.
Yes.
And then determine what it takes to get there.
Yep. You deserve to be a leader. You can be the leader if that's what you want.
I'll tell you this. I will be slightly vulnerable here and share this with you. This was actually in the interview process with Van Allen when I was applying for a different job. I wasn't applying to work for Van Allen, but in one of the interviews, I don't remember what the question was, but I remember very vividly what Don said to me, because even though it was a Zoom call like you and I are having now, he looked me in the eye and said, "You are enough."
Oh, cool.
And having someone be willing to believe in you and tell you that you are enough is worth its weight in gold. And we don't do it enough for one another.
Yep.
And so look yourself in the mirror if necessary. Tell yourself that you are enough and you deserve to be a leader. Now, what are you going to do to make that happen?
Oh, super great advice. It really is. Because you are. And I want to mention too, I love all these, like the MBA that Tracy did. And I think we might have some people in the audience saying, yeah, well, I don't have maybe all the money for that, or I don't have the time for that. Maybe some other ideas too are read a book on leadership, keep reading on them. You can get those things from the library. Those are even less, maybe not so expensive ways to continue your education and just show that you want to be that leader.
No, there's absolutely alternatives or options, right? It's in the same way as you think of the safety model as the Swiss cheese model with all of these holes. Think about the reverse of that, where all of those are opportunities. Do not say no to one of those opportunities and try to find as many of them as you can. So if it is reading a book, then use that. I've been doing some executive coaching with a chief pilot who's new to role, who is not a reader. But if you can find the book on Audible, he's more than happy to listen to it, right? So find the mechanism that's going to work for you in that sense. Take the PDB classes, take the programs that you can that are not that expensive. And then, of course, there's the option of the CAM, which we haven't really said
I wanted to talk to you about that. Yep.
But the CAM, the way I got to take my CAM, which has been almost 10 years ago, was I won a scholarship at NBAA that paid for my CAM.
Cool.
So, now, it doesn't pay for you to retake it if you don't pass it. So you got to do yourself a favor and pass it for some round. But I felt like it was expensive, but I wanted to do it. So I wasn't going to let expensive be a no to me, in the same way that you don't let obstacles in your day-to-day role as a dispatcher be a no. You always find a way wherever you can to turn it into a yes or a possibility. And so I won a scholarship for that. And the scholarship allowed me to be able to get it. And what it will do for you, especially if you have aspirations to be a leader in your department, not just a manager, but a director level leader or higher, is it will broaden your exposure to the other elements that maybe you don't have as much exposure to, right? So there's components in there around HR and HR related risk. There's components there around hangar management and what you have to think about that are not maybe your day-to-day responsibilities. So those things, as you get exposure to those, also become areas that when your organization is going through an exercise that says, hey, we're getting a new aircraft and we have to reconsider our hangar space and how we're going to stack aircraft. We have a customer now who's acquiring a new aircraft that will not fit in their current hangar based on the size of the hangar doors, right? So they have to do some considering. Is it build a new hangar? Is it get new doors, right? There's a lot of consideration. All of those kinds of things. Is it negotiating a new lease with Signature or Atlantic if you're housed at one of their locations? Anytime those things come up, if you have aspirations for leadership, then raise your hand and say, can I be a part? Can I just sit in and observe and ask questions afterwards, right? And use that as your internal education, because those are your actual job. They're going to be your job responsibilities. And so take advantage of them when they come up. If they're buying a new aircraft, tell them, I want to sit in this whole process as we acquire a new aircraft so I can understand what is entailed in both selling an asset and acquiring a new one. All of those things are opportunities for learning that are not going to be taught in your MBA class or in some other learning opportunity, but they're going to grow you in a way that you need to grow.
And I think what you said just a moment ago, you said those projects are going to be what you're doing as a leader, right? So I think maybe sometimes people think this leader does all these elusive projects and, I don't know, behind the scenes stuff that you have no idea what it's all about. And really it's not. All you're doing maybe is, I shouldn't say all, but what you're doing is larger ticket items, perhaps maybe larger decisions, but ultimately you are doing very similar types of things. You're taking a project, you're figuring out all the pros and cons of it, and you're making the best choice and decision possible using your resources. So I think that sometimes leadership looks elusive just because maybe you don't know what's actually being done on a daily basis. I mean, for my leadership, my day consists of talking to different employees, talking to vendors, but it also includes looking at the checkbook and making sure that that's up to date. And a lot of these smaller things, just like you're saying, if you try them out, the more experience you have, just the better. And you get to network again too. You get to meet those people that are parts of those projects, which, like you've had, you may end up with a really great connection that brings you to your next opportunity.
Absolutely. And when I say hitch yourself to a good leader, especially if you want to be successful in aviation, that might have to be outside of the aviation department, because there are some that are not in that space of being good leaders, not the kind that you want to emulate. In fact, an individual I've been working with a lot, when asked about where does his model of leadership come from, all of his model is based almost exclusively on negative experiences. So here's what I've learned, doesn't work, kind of a thing, which is certainly one way, but you would love to have some positive experiences. And so hitch yourself to someone. And if it's not your director of aviation, consider director of maintenance, because maybe that's the individual who has the real ability to impart the kinds of knowledge that you want. The one thing I would add, though, to what you were talking about in terms of, hey, sometimes it's just bigger ticket items, is the two areas we probably see that are lacking the most when we are doing leader level searches, right?
Yeah.
This is an aviation department leader. When we're doing those searches, the areas we see people lacking the most are, one, they tend to think tactically more than strategically. And so you have to develop this ability to think strategically. This is the big picture perspective. How does this aviation department benefit the organization? And too many times we run into departments that have an innate belief that the company exists to support the aviation department instead of the other way around. And they feel a sense of entitlement and specialness about who they are. And they really need to have an understanding of who the organization is and how the aviation department helps their organization be successful, right? How do we help this company be a winner in the market space that they're in? The second is an adjunct to this strategic thinking piece, and that is the ability to have conversations with the executive suite. So it's being able to speak in a language that's not full of aviation acronyms that we use day in and day out as though we're giving them a NOTAM brief. It's the ability to have C-suite level conversations, which is where Tracy did such an amazing job saying, I need to learn some concepts that are not a part of my daily job. I'm going to get an MBA, right? It's where you recognize what's going to help me be successful in that space. That's where classes like the GSU, the Georgia State, and the Case Weatherhead, Darden, those programs are going to help you move from tactical to strategic and help you with the conversations at the executive level.
Really good point. Super good point. Andy, thank you so much for all of your wisdom that you've shared with us today. And what a great role model and inspiration for those of us who are in the scheduler dispatcher role who want to get to a leadership role or consulting role. I mean, I have to think too, like I kind of said in the beginning, I don't know if there's a lot of scheduler and dispatchers who have moved into the consulting role. That also tends to be, and I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but it tends to also be a pilot-centric type of role. So congratulations for being in that position, in both those positions.
Yeah, thank you. And it's absolutely been a pleasure. We, and I think I speak for Van Allen, are true fans of everything that you've been able to do at LD. When we run into clients that have a need for what it is that you provide, and COVID has really allowed people to see this is something you can do as a model. Oftentimes we will run it, we'll do a staffing sort of analysis and get a sense of, are you appropriately balanced, whether it be flight crews, flight attendants, maintenance. But scheduling dispatch, more often than not, is at the bottom of that equation. They're the last in that conversation, and they're expected to, they get time off, but they're expected to answer their phone. So is it time off? And what
Right.
you provide is a solution to those folks that are not looking to have an FTE, but
Mhm.
need to be able to backfill, give people some quality of life, and truly impressed with what you've been able to pull off. And certainly not
you.
an easy road to haul, but you've stuck with it. And congratulate. I saw that you are now branching out with some charter.
We are.
So congratulations.
Yes. Thank you. So we've gotten, well, one, this is kind of a passion of mine. I just really want those smaller flight departments or larger ones that may not have their backup to be able to take some vacation, because I think I've seen actual like relationships and families, not work out because they always have their phone on. And that's what, anyway, but yes, on a side note, I'm excited because we have a little bit of 121. We've got heavily 91, and now we're branching into 135 because 135, similarly to the 91, they get quotes, requests 24/7, and they don't have time off. Yeah, I'm hoping that we can help out a couple of other departments with some quality of life.
Yeah, you're going to find yourself with too much work pretty soon.
That's all right. Bring it on. We've got Krista and Tracy kind of managing that side, so I'm sure they'll find lots of great people to add in there. Well, Andy, thank you again very much. Oh, hey, Andy, in case somebody might want to get a hold of you, is LinkedIn the best? Like if they have a question, is that the best place to find you?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn is probably up to date, at least with my Van Allen information. So they can certainly get me that way. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. And it's MAWDSLEY for your last name.
Correct.
Awesome.
Yeah. And so it'll be my first initial A and then Mawdsley at vanallen.com if they just want the email.
Okay.
Mawdsley at vanallen.com.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you again very much. And actually, hopefully we can come back to you again, because I never even asked you about living in South Africa. I think that sounds like a really whole separate podcast, but it would be really interesting.
Yeah, in fact, our daughter just turned 13. And so we got to take a family trip to South Africa. It's a beautiful, beautiful country.
Wow.
Everybody should have it on their bucket list. If you don't, you need to put it on your bucket list.
Yeah, it's on mine for sure. Definitely. Well, we'll catch back up with you at a different time. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Lindy. Appreciate you.
You bet. Likewise. Thank you for listening. Please stay tuned for more episodes and check out our website for up-and-coming podcasts. This has been a production of the Business Aviation Collective, sponsored by LD Aviation.